Are you ready to embark on a transformative journey of rebuilding your life? Look no further than the Rebuild podcast. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that nurture personal and spiritual growth. Through the wisdom of the Word of God and practical applications, we'll guide you towards becoming the best version of yourself. On this podcast, we will delve into a variety of topics and insights, ranging from mental and emotional well-being to personal development and spiritual growth. Together, we'll explore the paths to healing, resilience, and the restoration of inner peace. Subscribe now and let's rebuild our lives together, one uplifting conversation at a time.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Rebuild podcast. I am your host, Sean Romey, and today I would like to talk about grace under pressure. In other words, navigating life's challenges with resilience and strength. And the reason I want to talk about this particular subject, I think that for a lot of us, we're taught about going through the storm. We're supposed to embrace the storm, go through the storm, understand that the storm is necessary for growth, development, cultivation, etc., etc. And I'll liken this from the standpoint to being in school. So being in elementary school, in middle school, being in high school, we're always taught whatever lessons we're supposed to be taught, and then we're tested on it right away. And the thing is, if you really get down into it, at least I know from my own experience, a lot of what we learned before we're transitioning into the next grade, or even in transitioning to the next grade, it's basically just a lot of memorization and regurgitation. So I remember it, and then I just repeat what I remembered. And it's not so much that I'm not learning how to apply it. It's just I'm remembering it long enough to do what's necessary, and then that's it. I don't really know how to apply these things appropriately, right? Because we're not fixated on the right application for these things. When you get to college, it's a lot different, right? In some phases it's still the same. You do have your regular, work that you do, and you do kind of remember some things, but you're more apt to have to learn how to apply these things appropriately. So you might be asked about scenarios and situations. You might have to do research to talk about what it is that you're bringing forth, and why this topic is what it is, or why this, the particular segment at hand is what it is. Right? You're having to put it into your own words, and that is a lot more of what we should be teaching in terms of living the life, as opposed to just telling everyone about, and showing everyone just how to read the word. Right? And I believe we talked about that in the last episode, where we talked about being practical. Towards the end, you read in James where, what good is it for us to tell our brothers and sisters if they're in need of something, be of good faith, and hopefully everything will fall in line for you. That's kind of pointless. And sadly enough, or ironically enough, that's kind of the way we teach. Right? We teach in a way that we don't really learn how to be, quote, disciples. And disciples is really discipline. It's a practice of discipline. And we're not really practicing how to, become disciples ourselves, to teach disciples. We're realistically creating more followers, as opposed to, putting into practice what we learn. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about, how we can navigate facing, challenging situations, because we go through them all the time. And in some cases, the practicality behind what we're supposed to put into practice based on what the Word of God says is a lot easier than us, not really realizing it. Because we've been taught so much about memorization, memorizing the verses, memorizing the verses, memorizing the verses. Memorize and pray, memorize and praise, memorize and pray, memorize and praise. And we kind of really don't know how to see it from that practical place. I want to talk about how we can maintain composure, right, in situations, being calm and acting with not just strength but wisdom too during these times of challenge, right? The cultivation, the trials, the walls, the tribulations, the setbacks, the pitfalls, the traps, the snares, the tricks, the attacks, the deceptions, whatever you want to call it, right? It's important for us to know how to navigate these things, recognize these things, get to the bottom of these things, so on and so forth, so that we can be exactly what we're purposed to be. Not just that, but to overcome these things too, to navigate and build our faith, build our strength. And again, as we're becoming disciples in that regard, we're sharing with others how to become disciples. That's a fulfillment of God's word from way back in the very beginning. I've talked about that a few times too. And then we're going to go through, again, just without beating a dead horse, we're going to make this as practical as possible. Right? I want to transition into a particular verse before we actually start. And you've heard me use this verse probably a lot, especially within the last few episodes, but this is definitely one that I've memorized over the last few years, and it really has kind of become one of the staples in my life. That's Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. And it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not unto your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he'll direct your path. And in this passage, right, we're allowing ourselves, we're giving a certain allegiance, if you will, to God. We have a certain belief that God is going to do what he said he's going to do. Now, we're taught this, we regurgitate this, we spit this out, we talk about it a lot in church, during worship services, during the sermons, during intercession and other things along that line, a lot. But when it comes to the actual acting out of this trust, sometimes it doesn't go that way, right? Sometimes we don't trust the process. Sometimes we take matters into our own hands. Sometimes, we think we know better, right, about certain things and how they'll play themselves out. And from that same vein, we won't allow God to do what he's purposed to do, right? And it comes with the territory. Sometimes, we get into that place, well, God's not here, or I can't see God, or, whatever other kinds of thoughts we may have, that, we'll just take matters into our own hands and do things our own way. And sometimes the ways that we do them or the ways that we respond to them, they can contradict God's will and purpose, causing a lot of problems. And we don't want to do that. But we're going to, again, that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about the power of perspective, just to start off. Right? And when we get into the idea, right, of the perspective, we want to talk about having not just a positive mindset, but we want to have a realistic mindset when we're overcoming difficulties. And the reason that I say a practical or a realistic mindset over a positive mindset is, if I'm just as overly negative as I am overly positive, I can create a huge delusion behind it. Right? I'll use as an example. So let's say that you're going to the doctor, right? You have a stomach ache. You don't know why. You just woke up with a stomach ache, and you're going to the doctor's office, and the super negative side of you is going to think the worst. Some type of virus, some type of illness. You might have, backed up colon or whatever the case may be, right? Which would mean that, it's going to be a long day, right? And in your stay at the doctor's office, and that's not a good place to be, right? Because now you're putting into the atmosphere a lot of doubt, a lot of worry, a lot of concern, a lot of fear, a lot of, a whole bunch of other things that make this situation a lot worse than what it really could be. And like I said, in that same vein, if I'm overly positive, if I'm going in and I'm saying, oh, everything's going to be fine, there's not going to be anything wrong, I'm denying the fact that I'm actually in pain at the present moment. That's not to say that all the time being overly positive means that, again, you're speaking things into existence. But the mere fact that, again, you're getting to a point where you are denying the current situation, it can, sometimes we can overlook that. Right now, I do understand too that not just from that same space, but again, being overly positive in that regard can also mean that you're denying yourself an opportunity to find a solution. And on top of that, you're setting yourself up, because if something bad does come out of this, now you're going from one overly high experience into another one. You'll go from a really high to a very low. And that's, again, not something you want to really do. Right? You do want to find yourself being realistic. Right? So being there, okay, I'm in pain. I don't want this to be the worst, but I'm also, I'm not gonna put myself, in that crazy of a position. I look at it from my own experience. I worked a few MLMs over the course of my time in the military, just trying to find ways to build, multiple streams of income, wealth, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the ones I worked for, or as an example, one of the ones I worked for, we had a lot of different trainings. Most of them you had to pay for, and I get it, it's understandable, kind of the territory. But what I will say is, one of the things that really stuck out to me about being in this place is having to have a very positive mindset. And the mindset of that positivity can come across delusional. In fact, I would actually say that for some people, it kind of actually really was. Now, don't get me wrong. During the process, you're doing a lot of personal development, which is cool, and they're having you, they're having you work in and build your team and build your, getting your sales together and all that stuff, and that's cool. There's nothing wrong with that. But in the same token, being put in a position where, again, you have to be just so positive to the point that it becomes unrealistic is terrible. Now, again, that's not to say that it's not, you can't speak things into existence. We definitely want to speak things into existence, right? But we also want to make sure that we're not overlooking realism too, because sometimes you can find in processes like that too, as maybe mentioned with the last situation, you can find in that process as you're going along, you might find an opportunity in something else. And if you're realistic about that, then it's easier for you to find that way out, that way of escape, or that way get you to the result that you're really looking for. Right? Because again, sometimes that overly positive mentality can keep you distracted just as much as the overly negative side will. So I just want to say that. So when we're talking about a mindset and overcoming difficult situations, we do want to be realistic. Okay, because realism will also allow it to be, hey, maybe I'm in too deep and I need to take a step back. That doesn't mean that it's completely over. I might really need to take a step back. Maybe I bit off more than I could chew. Maybe I went in a direction I wasn't supposed to go in, and that allows us again to be able to reset. I'm seeing a lot more. Great example of this in social media and mainstream media. You're seeing a lot of people who are older and they're graduating with degrees, whether it be high school, going back to school and getting their GEDs or their high school diplomas. Some of them going back and getting their bachelors and their masters, and even doctorates in some cases at older ages. That's perfectly fine, right? You never know, right? You might have been in a situation the first time around, it might have been too much. You might not have had a sense of direction, whatever the case may be. I tell people this all the time. Like I look at my situation. I'm in a place where I really wanted to have multiple degrees. At one point I was really young. I thought it would be really cool to be a doctor. And by doctor, I'm not talking the physician doctor. Having a good doctorate degree and being called doctor. Thought that would have been cool. Oh, Dr. Sean, that'd be really cool. It has a nice ring to it. But when I went to school, I really didn't have a sense of direction. I thought I did, but I really didn't. I look back at all of that, and at one point, I was considering being an architect for a major. I really wanted to get into architecture. That was my thing. My mom and my brothers would tell you, like, I would create buildings out of toys, and I was always just doing all kinds of stuff along that line. I've always been fascinated with city skylines and cityscapes. I've saved them. I've taken pictures of them. I've gone on deployments. That's been one of my favorite things over the course of time. That's always been something that I've been excited about. Having, no idea how to do that, no one really guided me in the right direction on how to do that. I didn't know that I needed to have certain experiences to help me to go along that path. So, I was kind of going in a direction that I wasn't ready for. And one of the reasons why, that was what it was, most of the people that saw me, oh, you're a smart kid, you're a good kid, you got a good head on your shoulders, we're not worried about you. Whatever you decide to do, that we know you're going to get it done. And I get it, understandable, but sometimes even still, you need that kind of guidance in that place too. And so I couldn't find architecture as a major for a lot of schools. But one of the things that did stand out and seemed to be pretty prevalent was mechanical engineering. And so I didn't know at the time that those two things were completely unrelated, right? I didn't know that. If I wanted to go down an engineering field that was closely related to architecture, it would have been civil engineering. And I'm learning this more on the back end. I'm like, oh, I by the time I figured that out, I was already in the military. I was like, oh, that makes a lot more sense. But by that point, I'd gone to school, started off in mechanical engineering, and it was quite a bit. I was taking classes that I really wasn't ready for either. And it's not so much that the curriculum was super strict. I was a 3.5 student. I was a solid kid, but what really got me was everything else. Right? I wasn't prepared for all of that. So, I go down that path, and I'm, at the same time, I'm wanting to play college basketball, and I'm starting to realize I'm kind of in over my head. Like I stay at the school for another year, just to kind of get myself back on track, and I changed majors because I realized the engineering thing / architecture thing wasn't going to be it. Not that I couldn't do it, but that wasn't, no one, again, when I found out what it was, I was like, oh, okay, mechanical is completely different. And, okay, that makes sense. Yes, I did say I didn't find out about civil engineering until I got in the military. And that's true. When I actually went back and actually looked at all of the different engineering majors, I was looking for an app. I was trying to build buildings, and it was an app that was a civil engineering app, and that's how I figured it out. And like I said, I was in the military by that point. That's how I found out. So I don't want people going, "Oh, he's mixing up his stories." No, that's what happened. So I changed my major up to that point a couple times. Went from that to journalism and advertising, into business. And the reason I changed into business is the last school I went to didn't have journalism, which really kind of dragged. But, I really wanted to go down the journalism path. I figured I'd just do that, despite as much writing as I had to do. But I like the idea of being a media, i.e. why I'm doing the podcast. I also like the idea at this point too, because I'm working on the blog at the same time. But that's what I changed into, right? And like I said, in that process and being realistic, I found that outlet. And don't get me wrong, I still wanted to play ball, so that was one of the reasons I stayed in school, and I tried to push it out as long as I could. But once I got to a point that I realized like it was starting to become a lot, and things really weren't going the way that I expected them to go, I pulled out for a while. And I think it was about 5 years before I went back to school. And in that process, it was a different process, but it was, kind of the same thing. I started to realize that I wasn't going to get the support I needed. And so I pulled right back out. But knowing where I am now, I know, what I plan on doing and how to go about doing it. And I'm good, so I best believe I'm going back to school, right? But that's a realism, right? And it's not necessarily a difficulty because, again, I'm realizing how the process works, right? And that's being not just positive because I still want to do this, but it's also being realistic and realizing that, I didn't have a sense of direction from the beginning. And that, that can open up a lot of doors of understanding. And it makes sense. Okay, I got it. I can move forward from there. For reframing challenges too, which is great because that's the next point. Seeing obstacles as opportunities for growth and learning. Right? One of the reasons why I'm so big on wanting to be in mentorship or in guidance or, in leading in that regard is because I look at my own situation. Like I said, I look at that for myself. And I remember, saying to myself 20 years ago, 25 years ago, if I had someone that was actually like asking me these questions the way that I've asked some of these people questions, and just kind of following up and seeing how people really are trying to get where they're wanting to go, then I'm good. And then another thing you start realizing in that place too, I started realizing is sometimes we set goals, and the reason we're setting the goals is so we can have people get off our back. But the realism is we really don't know what we want to do, and we just kind of go through the motions, which is never a good thing. But once we realize the challenges that we're going through, and we're setting our mind and fixating ourselves on getting better and achieving our goals, that's what we're looking for. and when we see the opportunity arise to cultivate, to grow, to be better, to be bigger, to get wiser, or whatever the case may be, we find, in those situations that it's all necessary. I tell people this a lot. Like, mentally, I still have the passion to want to play professional basketball. The realism in me lets it be known, physically, that's not going to happen. And then if I go back and reflect on 15 years ago, even then, the realism was also, I had to come to terms with the idea that if, I feel a certain kind of way about playing basketball, whatever issue or concern I may have, because I'll meet the requirement. But if basketball starts to become, the problem, then where do I go? Because I've allowed basketball to be my safe space for years. And learning to have that taken away from me, and not taken away from me like I was, forced out of it, or, I was, I had a nasty injury that, I could never recover from. What I mean by having it taken away from me is just, again, getting to a point of realizing, because it's a time sensitive element, if you understand what I mean by that. Right, by a certain point in time, you should be kind of working on some things. My brother can attest to this. My brother had been trying to go pro for a while. He managed to play some semi-pro ball for a couple teams, which was fun. He won a few championships in that regard, and that, it's a process. But he talked about that, and the type of work he had to put in for that. And, that's if you're not already in the circles and in the lights and all that other stuff. But I'm looking at him in that regard, and I'm looking at myself in that regard, and I realize, for him, he even now, even though he's at the age he's at, he's still wanting to push for it. And I'm more, I've accepted it at this point. Yeah, okay, this really wasn't for me, and not to say that I didn't want to do it, but again, the realism kicked in. Yeah, I could have gone and played, and yeah, I could have had on my resume I played pro ball for a while, but then reality starts to set in at that point. At what am I trying to do after that? That was one of the, reasons I found an opportunity in joining the military, so I could kind of structure my life, refigure some things out, seeing that opportunity to grow and to learn. And that's, again, why we have to be realistic, not just positive. Another example we can look at in this regard that really gets us into understanding how everything lines us up for a specific purpose is looking at the story of Joseph. And if you want to read the story of Joseph, you go back to the book of Genesis. I'd say about chapter 37 all the way to the end. That is the story of Joseph. And you can see all of the great details that he goes through. He was Jacob's favorite son because he was the firstborn of Rachel. Rachel was the wife that Jacob really wanted. And, while working for Laban, he had to take on Leah first, which he worked 7 years for Leah, and then 7 years for Rachel. And then, obviously going from that point, taking care of not just Rachel and Leah, but then their maidservants too. So he had, 4 different mothers to his children, and he had a number of children with Leah, a number of children with the 2 maidservants, and he was trying really hard to have a child with Rachel. It never worked. Then finally he gets towards the end of all of the children that are known as the 12 tribes, and in comes Joseph. And And again, we're all excited. Everybody's excited about that. And then I think the last one that Rachel had was Benjamin. I believe Joseph and Benjamin are the last two. And Joseph is his favorite. He treats him different. He treats him as a favored son. Kind of understandable when you consider the way that his father Isaac treated him towards his brother. Right? He really loved Esau. His father Isaac loved Esau. Esau looked like a man. He carried himself like a man. He acted like a man. He's just very manly, just raw, And his mother, really had more favoritism towards him, and you could tell how that goes. And that dynamic played itself out through his father, because Abraham is Isaac's father, and Abraham, had found that between Ishmael and Isaac was the chosen one. Isaac had to endure certain pains that Ishmael would inflict, because Ishmael, believed that he was going to be the chosen one. He was supposed to be, right? Because by birthright during that time period, firstborn was the one that got the inheritance, the birthright. And you can see in that lineage throughout the course of Genesis, that doesn't happen for 3 generations. Ishmael doesn't get it, Isaac does. Esau doesn't get the birthright, Jacob does. And so I could imagine, in that family, because Jacob loved Joseph so much, he probably would have been favored for the birthright, which makes sense. I get it, And then you're going into, he's got skills, he's got gifts, he's able to dream and all these other things. And it takes him into a world of just ups and downs, like being sold into slavery by his brothers, being imprisoned, being falsely accused, being lied on, and a whole bunch of other things, to becoming the second in command in the land of Egypt and saving millions and millions of people from starvation and death, due to a famine. You're talking about volumes of being spoken. But here's a man that really, understood that, he was just doing what he was purposed to do. Right? And the realism is, he never allowed it to get to him. Now, from a certain standpoint, that's the type of positivity that, we can speak of. Right? Understanding that this is all happening for a reason, whatever that reason may be, which he makes aware when he does confront his brothers. His brothers come to the land, they're searching for food, and he recognizes them. They don't recognize him. And, he, for lack of better words, he puts them through a test to make sure that, he knows that they're really, his brother. And they sit down, they fellowship together after they figure it all out. They make amends. And he tells his brothers, like, look, man, it's no harm done here. Like, all the things that you guys, had put me through at that point, it was necessary. I mean, look, what you guys did, it set up for me to, not just be here in this situation, but again, I'm saving millions and millions of lives in the process. And it was part of the will. Understandable, And that's the power that perspective can have. If we understand when these situations come, it's part of cultivation, and we're good. One of the things that really hurts us, before we go into the next point, one of the things that really hurts us behind the idea of talking about this, right? Being resilient, being able to focus and shifting our mindsets into being realistic and things of the sort, is A lot of times we spend a lot of the narratives on the same tests and trials that we accept will help us be cultivated as attacks from the enemy. And the downside to doing that is now we're deceiving ourselves. So we don't see these obstacles as real opportunities for growth and learning, but we see them more so as a means of someone is trying to stop us from becoming who we're supposed to be. And again, you go back and you look at the example we talked about with regard to school. If I'm memorizing and regurgitating and I'm not really knowing how to apply, then I'm gonna really have a struggle when it comes to actually taking what I've learned and putting it to good use. Right? Because, again, the way that we're taught, it's I'm given the information and then I immediately learn about that thing as I go through it. Right? And most of our learning experiences are taught like that. But this is not the same thing. Right? And for us to really see that, again, we have to learn how to find ourselves building a certain type of resilience. The first part of that is being realistic, right? And again, being able to take a step back if necessary. That is a normal thing. It's okay, right? I know sometimes we get told to push through it and fight through it, and we're always talking about pressing on and pressing and working and struggling and grinding, and it is necessary. Don't get me wrong. We do have to do that. But when it comes, again, to the practicality of it all, that time for pressing and grinding might also mean taking a step back. Being able to take a rest. Maybe being able to look at this from a different angle. Maybe to allow for an opportunity to look at this different. Again, I go back to my situation with regard to school. I pushed the way that I pushed for two reasons. One, I wanted to be a professional basketball player, and that was the only path at the time that you were really allowed to go, or that was the norm to go. So you go to school, and you go to school to play basketball. And then two, I put a lot of other people's expectations of what I was supposed to do on me. And so I'm trying not to let other people down. So I'm pushing and I'm like really going and running through brick wall after brick wall after brick wall, thinking that, it's going to eventually come down. And I'll be honest with you, the moment I came home from school, there were a lot of things that slowly started to click. And when those moments happen, when those timetables for the clicking happen, I realized that, again, I put myself under a lot of pressure. I really did. And great example, I had taken a calculus class at the second semester of my first year. I was failing the class within 2 weeks already. Just kind of worn out from the adjustment, because I wasn't really accustomed to the workload that was at this school. If I had gone to a smaller school, different story, which in retrospect, I should have done. But going through that process, I was like, oh wow, I didn't realize, and it was a lot. And going back and, taking everything, and like I said, when I get home, the first thing I do is say, you know what, I still have the book about learning how to do calculus. I'm going to teach myself calculus. And I remember, I'll never forget it. I opened the book and I'm reading the stuff. And as I'm reading the stuff, I'm like, it makes sense. Like, how could I not get this years ago? And part of the reason was the mindset that I had at that point. and thinking, I had to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this. And again, pushing through those things, not realizing it. I can say the same thing about, my time in the military. At one point, I was dead set on I'm going to make it to 20, make it to 22, and I'm going to get out. And you start getting to a point where you start realizing that, again, the realism is going to start to set in. And you're realizing that it's not going to happen. And I know a lot of people that are in that have become borderline suicidal, because it's a lot of pressure. You're going through a lot to advance, whether it's advancing in an enlisted side, trying to cross over into maybe an officer side, maybe a warrant officer side. There's a lot of requirements. There are a lot of things you have to do. The workload, you have a lot going on. And trying to maintain a healthy or balanced lifestyle, it's kind of difficult to do in a lot of cases. Plus, the type of people you have to deal with from time to time, it can be a lot of extra stress on top of that workload. And you're talking about, having to go through this every day. And for little to no rest on top of this, you can be overwhelmed really, really fast. And once you're at that point where you're fighting as hard as you can to stay afloat, it's really difficult to recover from. And some people don't recover at all. I've known of a few service members during my time in that found themselves in some tight spots and, decided it wasn't worth it anymore. And then I knew some that, became too much. And, they're not here anymore. And again, that's not something that God intended for. That's not what God wants. And so it's okay to, again, take a step back, right? It's okay to, allow ourselves to reset if we have to, right? That's a great thing in terms of looking at perspective in that regard. And then it's okay to bounce back if things don't work out the first time, right? In fact, in terms of building resilience, emotional resilience is just as important in navigating through our challenges. I know for a lot of us, especially being in the body of Christ, and I'm pretty sure I've talked about this before, we don't talk about the balance between the natural and the spiritual. And as a person, we all, we feel as people. And those feelings are not just there for us to just say, oh, we're just being emotional and those types of things. But what I am saying is, this is allowing us to know exactly where we are. If I become enraged, it's acceptable to say that I am upset in the moment. If I'm overwhelmed, it's okay to break down. It's okay to cry. Yeah, it's a lot. It happens. But in that same space, it's okay also to recognize those things and to push forward, as long as we're being able to cope in a rational or reasonable kind of way. Like and I know that mainstream society is really big on, pushing and going and fighting and grinding and going and hustling and getting it all going. You can't stop. The grind continues. I get it. And there are so many different, life coaches and gurus and influencers that push that. And what we don't get told a lot of is there's a lot of burnout that comes with that. And not just the burnout, right? But there's, the expectations that we're putting on ourselves. I go back to my situation again, being, having been the college student. I went through that same experience in the military. I found myself burnt out numerous times. And the more the burnout became evident, the more I really became, I really started to realize I was going to break. And, starting to become suicidal and other things along that line. And I thank God for my kids. I know my relationship with them is not anywhere what it was once before when they were really little, when I was in, and things were a little different. But I can honestly say that they are the reason I am here today, because I wouldn't want them to have to navigate the story of their lives and trying to understand why their daddy no longer is on this earth. But I do want it to be known, with regard to that situation, being in the military and having to go through all that stress and everything else, that again, in looking back at it and dealing with it and, trying to navigate through everything, as overwhelming as a lot of it was, I was learning how to find the right types of mechanisms to cope with. I did a lot of meditating. As a great example, I did a lot of meditating. One of the first times I was actually introduced was in one of the first classes I had to repeat during my time in at my very first school. And the professor, his name was Vince Lombardi. I don't know if he's related to the actual, the legendary coach, but he was a guy that spoke a lot about finding yourself and spending time in that vein. Taking time to reflect, taking time to assess life, looking at where you are, what you want, and just, really being in that space. That's the first time I was introduced to a meditation outside of the will of God. I mean, we talk about meditation, but most of the time when we talk meditation in the body of Christ, it's we meditate on God's word. And if you really don't know how to meditate on God's word, it's kind of difficult to do. And it was through that process that I learned how to meditate and kind of really figure out and learn some things. I started understanding who I was to a degree. But from that same space, I was able to learn how to put all of it together in terms of meditation, reflecting and looking back on things. And it became a regular thing, and I was very happy for that. I was very, very grateful for that process, because it helped me to look at a lot of things and to see things that I might have overlooked because I was so overwhelmed with, stresses and pressures and everything else. Because sometimes that happens. I also did a lot of journaling, which is another thing that I love about this practice here. Blogging and podcasting is I get to express my feelings. I realized also through life coaching and counseling and mentoring that I'm also able to share my experiences. And it's amazing how being in that space, doing all of that journaling, that that sharing, that getting those things off your chest, it really does allow for a certain peace of mind, right? One, the people that you might be sharing those things with get to see that, the struggle is always going to be there, but there's a possibility to navigate through this and come out on top. One aspect of discipleship. But then not only that, but for yourself, being able to get those things off your chest, it allows for, you to look back and see some of the things you've overcome. It allows you to really see the types of things that you were dealing with. Sometimes, you can also utilize this as a means of being able to see, how these things might be connected to other things of old, right? You can find out how certain stresses or certain problems or certain traumas might have been tied to something that happened to you that you didn't even realize were connected. It's a powerful thing. You can also look at your situations, and instead of maybe getting through the coping aspect, you can you can learn how to do technique creation. One of the things you can do is set small goals, right? Because sometimes we overwhelm ourselves. We want to do this really big thing, and if we don't realize how to set smaller goals, we can find ourselves really struggling. I learned that process again. A lot of these things I've learned the hard way, even though there are resources available that showcase otherwise. I will say that there are a lot of things I had to learn through experience more so than having to read about them or learn about them from another place. But I learned how to set smaller goals and kind of working in that aspect, that space, and in doing so, it all kind of you find out some things come back full circle. And the reason I say that, I look at everything that I've gone through and I experienced at that point. When you go back to the story of Joseph, when he tells his brothers that everything that he went through was part of the purpose, it was definitely part of the purpose. I've said this a few times on the podcast. Very rarely have I actually gone out and told people in public. Even realistically in ministry, I've barely told people. But I was first called to be a pastor when I was really young, about 5-6 years old. And it's the first time that someone told me that I was called to be a pastor. I'd been told this numerous times over the years, but I really didn't want it. I really wanted to run away from that because in that same space, I ran away from the responsibility. I think I had told it at one point. I think it was either in the men's group or a word I had given. I was about 8 years old when I came to, I had that epiphany, like realizing that there were people that were going to, I'm leading these people, and if I lead them the wrong direction, that's my responsibility. That's blood on my hands. And I was like, I don't want that. I don't want that responsibility. I don't want that blood on my hands. I really tried to run away from it, but everything that I've gone through has really led full circle back to this is what I'm supposed to do. And finding all of the passions and finding all of the traumas and the giftings and the troubles and the turmoils and all of these different things in that vein opened the door to realize, okay, this is part of the purpose. Got it. And being able to build, this aspect of ministry from this space is one of the small goals that I've had. Being able to get the stuff off my chest is part of the reason. Another part of the reason for this podcast, as well as the blog that I have as well. And not just that, but also realizing that again, these things are practical too, which is how the door opened to become, kind of more of a mentor / life coach, which I'm certifying for. So be on the lookout if I do make mention of it or announce it on the podcast. Just know that I am working towards that, as well as in other spaces too. You start seeing that all of these things are necessary, and setting those smaller goals allows you to attack the big thing as a whole, right? The smaller the chunk, the more manageable, the easier it is. It might be tedious in the long run, but trust me, it is worth it, right? Because you're allowing yourself to see the progress by dealing with things little by little. And sometimes you'll realize even as you're knocking those things out little by little, you'll notice that some things will start to fall apart on their own. You don't even have to address them or navigate them, because what was the foundation for that thing might have been tied into something else, and that cracks and breaks and crumbles, and it's able to be digested now, because you were able to deal with something that was the same, but it was attached to something else. Seeking support. We are not islands. We are not meant to do anything alone. We do have to have some type of support, whether it be your friends, your ministry, whether it be some type of support group. I'll admit this too. I went through a process. I went through an anger management course, and it was in that course I learned a lot about taking responsibility for me. But it wasn't in that class. I also realized that for a lot of us as men, we don't have a lot of spaces where we can go where we feel safe, or we can be safe and be vulnerable. I realized that in that class, and that was years ago. So there's another avenue there, right, that we can look at as a means of seeking support and guidance. Knowing that we can find and meet needs, because that's necessary. And then knowing, even though you're in positions of leadership, you're not alone. You can look for other leaders to help you and guide you. It's one of those things I learned in the military too. Even guys that were high ranking still look for mentorship and guidance from other high ranking people. It comes with the territory. No one is without exempt from that aspect. And if you're not learning or seeking support and guidance from somewhere else, more than likely you're going to stagnate. And then, of course, practicing gratitude, right? Being thankful for the things. And this kind of ties more into the positive mindset aspect, but that positivity is not the same as the delusion of positivity, right? When you're talking about positivity from this standpoint, again, you're being appreciative of what you have, where you are. And it's not the same as being, overly positive to the point where you're not allowing yourself to be realistic. That's a huge difference. And then, of course, we want to build inner strength through spiritual practice and self-reflection. So you're talking about, being in a place of meditation, right? Again, we talked about earlier, praying, reading the Word. I know I've talked about, that's not the only thing, and I do mean that it's not the only thing. But I've also said that those are the key things, and I stick to that too. When we are reading, we're looking for clarity. We're not reading just for the sake of just reading. And again, memorizing and regurgitating is not the same thing as being able to apply the word. And then when we're praying, we're not praying for the sake of, we're just trying to find the easy way out, right? We're looking for, a guidance, right? Go back to Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Right? If I'm looking for guidance, if I'm asking for guidance, that's what I'm expecting. Right? And then self-reflection. This is one that I think is really important, because a lot of us really need to learn how to be transparent and honest and objective. Mostly because, we're taught and trained a lot to look at ourselves in the best possible light. And there's nothing wrong with that. But again, like having the mindset, sometimes we can put ourselves in a position where we'll think of ourselves so high to the point that, again, delusion is created. We're never doing anything wrong. And even if we do, accept that we might have done something wrong, we're more than likely going to, address it in a backwards kind of way, or we're addressing it in a way to where we're really pointing the finger at you. It's really your fault, but we'll just say, for formality's sake, that we'll accept responsibility. And we don't want to do that again, because that's not God's will and purpose. Right? If we're accepting that we did something wrong, then we should see, what it is we did, and we should learn how to navigate that, how to grow from that, how to make amends with that, how to make peace with that, so that we don't make that mistake again. And that's completely different than, having a sideways type of apology or sideways type of closure, because that really, puts a lot of onus on another person, especially if you're really the one at fault. And again, that's not God. We don't want to do that. But let's talk about, from that place, since we're talking about being, inner or inward, let's talk about, getting into that inner strength, finding, ourselves being us. When we're talking about, being able to persevere, it's really important to navigate through that space. But in order to do that, we want to make sure, again, and I can't stress it enough, we're realistic, right? When we're too negative, again, as we talked about earlier, we don't allow ourselves to see opportunity. When we're too high and positive, we don't allow ourselves to see, the truth of where we really are. And that could really cause a lot of problems, right? And in both cases, we're missing a lot of details. We don't want to do that, right? And it's okay to motivate yourself and say that you can do it and you got it and things of that sort. But from a real rational and a realistic place, it allows for us to, again, make more healthy decisions. That's not to say, again, that we have to push through and persevere and work hard and put on the facade of the perception that things are okay. But it does allow us an opportunity to be realistic. Again, perseverance doesn't necessarily have to look like, I gotta finish this thing no matter what, right? Because sometimes we chase those things for the story. Never a good thing to do, because now we're taking so much focus off of God and we're putting it on us, and that never bodes well, because then the people really don't get the message. I see this a lot with some of the motivational messages that I see on social media, where we're going out and we're trying to say these things that sound really nice, and to a lot of people it can be motivating, but in all reality, what we're really saying, especially in alignment with God's will and purpose, can be contradictory to what God's word really says, and we don't want to do that. So we want to make sure, with building inner strength and finding that resilience and finding that necessity, it is rooted in God's will, but it's also being practiced from a place of wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. And, from that place, it might be taking a step back. That's okay. It might be, starting over. That's okay. Right, again, because it's a realistic perspective, not a facade. God is all about authenticity. Okay? When we think about this, we want to think about some of the things that we've overcome. Because sometimes we miss that, we have overcome through a lot of things. My mom used to do this to me all the time when I found myself stuck. She would always go back to my time in middle school and my time in high school. And again, like I tell everybody, and it was pretty obvious. I was so infatuated with the game of basketball. It was there. But when I first started playing organized basketball, I wasn't that good. I'll admit that. I was terrible. I was so far behind the 8 ball. It was bad. But I really wanted to play ball, and I went through a lot. You know, I got teased in a lot of cases by my peers, because I wasn't that good, different, et cetera, et cetera. I was made fun of by older people because what am I doing out there? I wasn't that good, and so on. I mean, there's so many other different things, and the older I got, it didn't really, the dynamic really didn't change that much. But once, I got to around my senior year, certain things started to click. And I went from being an unknown people, someone that people overlooked to, by the time my high school career was over, I was, all-state honorable mention. And I was like, wow, that's pretty amazing. And I know that for some, that doesn't seem like a big deal. Again, you're talking about coming from nothing, like nowhere. And, at the time, just the growth, the growth, the persistence, the development, the goals that I had set and everything else, just making the most of, all of the opportunity and everything else along that line, it paid dividends in the end. And, my mom would use that story. I would use that story too to help motivate me. Like, yeah, I overcame this, this, that, and the third. And, those are some of the things that I look at to help, build that type of perseverance, because it is necessary. Like I said, we want to be realistic too, because sometimes it is okay to take steps back. It's okay to look at, an opportunity to go in a different direction. Maybe seeing an opportunity within an opportunity. That happens too, But when you're looking at your own challenges, and this is something that you can do on your own time if you want to, think about the things that you've overcome. Divorce, loss of life, maybe something like me, where you wanted to, be something, and you had to go through and overcome a lot to get to that point. Certain successes, graduating from school, whatever the case may be, there are lots of places where we can see our perseverance really take hold, if you will. And look at what you had to go through. Look at the qualities that you built in the process. That's always a great thing. One of the verses I used to utilize when I would play is Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And I would say that before free throws. I would say that before the game. I would always make reference to that because I thinking about what I had to overcome, and even in the process of being in college and trying to play basketball in college, it's the same thing. Went through a lot, having to battle through injuries and losing and all kinds of other things. But it was all necessary, and it reminds us, when we go back and reflect on that is, God showing us that we can get through things, right? And sometimes, just the things that we're going through or we're dealing with, they're not there for the purpose of us to, become victims, but really to showcase, just how powerful God is and how powerful He made us, because we're made in His image and likeness. And sometimes the thing that really hurts us about not really understanding the type of inner strength we might have, because this is very common, is dealing with things from an unknown perspective, right? Being uncomfortable. A lot of us go through a lot of discomfort, when we're talking about, we're talking about going into an environment you've never been in before, maybe meeting a person, things along that line. And, when we're embracing that type of uncertainty, um, do understand first and foremost that's inevitable. We're always going to find ourselves in places where we're uncertain. You never know what's going to happen within the next hour, the next minute, the next day, the next step you take. You never know, right? Even when you try to do and repeat the routine the same way, the routine's not going to be the same. It's just not going to happen. There's going to be some type of uncertainty. There's going to be something that comes up. And in a generalization, sure, that works. But when you're talking big picture, different story. You know what I mean? But when we're, in this place, let's, we have to talk about being able to adapt and to adjust and to change and to navigate through this space. Right? This is again where Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 come into play. Right? When we're able to pivot appropriately. And in that pivot, we're allowing ourselves to do what we have to do. Okay. It's imperative for us to know what that looks like. Right? The concept of being able to know how to recognize where we are. That's first and foremost. Right? And again, sometimes that comes with taking that step back. I take the step back and I realize that, okay, this is really what's going on. Now I know what to do. Maybe I don't have the opportunity or the time to take a step back. Then let me pivot. Maybe a change of direction might open some things up. The job I used to do in the military poses as a great example in this regard. When we would have to practice for, certifications and things of that sort, one of the things that we were taught is, it's okay to take a refresher. If you have to change perspective, maybe you have to stand up, take a step back, maybe change the way you're looking at a thing, get some fresh air, whatever. Give yourself an opportunity to see things a little different. And you'll be surprised. Sometimes that pivot will really help, and it'll really put things into perspective. Like I said, I go back and I talk about the opportunity that I had to learn, or teaching myself calculus. It was unfortunate for me. Like I didn't stick to it that long, mostly because I was transitioning into the home that my mom currently lives in now, and I was trying to find work, but it was interesting going back and learning that, and again, just how easy it was not having the pressure, which is a huge deal. I think about also too. So in the military, we have warfare games, and you're supposed to have them within a certain period of time, given your rank and all that stuff, classmanship and everything along that line. And I remember, when I was going through the process, it was difficult. It was a lot. Like I said, you get overwhelmed with a lot of things at one point. It happens. And, I tried to do it along the line with everybody else, and it wasn't working. And what ended up happening is over time, it became just that much more difficult to do. And I ended up becoming delinquent, which is not a good thing, right? Because that's a bad mark. People don't like that, and you get looked at negatively for it. But it ended up being a blessing for me. It was a blessing in disguise, because once that pressure was off of trying to hurry up and get it within the time period and everything else along that line, stuff started to click. And I realized at that point, it was that pressure. It was the pressure that was really making things that much more difficult. Because once everything clicked, it was easy. Like not only did everything make sense up to that point, but then, when I go to get qualified and certified in that area, it was it was easy. Not saying that it was all bad, or I was really just out of it. But there were some things that I just, like I said, it made sense. Certain things clicked the way that they did. And I was like, okay, makes sense. And I would tell my guys that, like, hey, look, don't let those pressures get to you like that. This even helped me later on as I was, trying to advance into the next rank. And the last time I had took my advancement exam for advancement, I was so relaxed and so chill to the point that you wouldn't have even known that I was taking an advancement exam. That's how relaxed I was, And from that space, there were so many things, even prior to that, there were, other exams that I could go back and look at that I scored very well in, and literally missing it by a question. I'm like that close. But with this one, I didn't study. I didn't do anything. I just said to myself, what I know, what I don't know, and I'm just going to leave it at that. And I took the exam. I went through the questions. I did the thing, and I was surprised at how much, I still remembered. I mean, still practicing the stuff, in the workplace. But it was still just like, wow, it's surprising. I didn't realize, I was still retaining all of this information. And sure enough, I was able to advance, and I was like, wow, this is awesome. I am excited. And like I said, that's the same thing I would tell my guys. Like, don't put the extra pressure on yourself. It's not that serious. Yes, you'll make it or you won't make it. And that's okay. Don't beat yourself up if you don't make it. But, don't put so much on yourself to the point that, you're, working yourself into a thing. Because then you're going to panic. You're going to worry. You're going to trip up. You're going to fall. And that's the downside to, being in that place when you're in the unknown. Right? When you're in that unknown, you worry, you panic, you fret, you think twice, you doubt, you double talk, you do all kinds of different things, you self-sabotage, and you become very unstable. You don't know what you're doing, why you're doing it. But when you allow that pressure to, you realize it's not that serious. It's not that big a deal. It's not, as out there as what we try to make it out to be. You realize, first thing again, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. You're trusting in God's plan. If God says that, okay, you got it. Right? In other words, you go back to what I know, what I don't know, and you build from that point. We can be able to adjust then from that place. Okay, let's say I don't make it. Okay, now I know what I need to work on. Right? I can pivot. I know what to do now. And that was one of the things that my buddy and I had actually planned on doing before we had taken that exam. I was looking over the scores and seeing where my weaknesses really were, and really wanting to work at building on those. And even though he and we had solid plans for it, the cycle of the military really doesn't allow for it. We say it, but reality was completely different. But that adds into the next thing, and that's being able to focus on what we can control, and then letting go of what you can't. When you're in an uncertain place, everything that is not attached to you is basically out of your control, right? And the more you start to realize that, the more you're able to, again, let and release a lot of pressure off of you, because we don't realize just how much pressure we put on ourselves by thinking like that. by carrying ourselves like that, by, going through and, putting on this aspect, this dynamic that, we have to control everything. That's a trauma response, but I'll hopefully I'll talk about that in another episode. But when we're able to let go of things that we can't control, and I think there's a prayer, right? God grant me the serenity to change the things I can change, accept the things I can't, and knowing the difference between the two, or something along that line. Don't quote me on that, but I do know that prayer is out there. It's something like that. And that gives us the room to, again, take matters into our hands that we can. And the things that we can't, just let it go. Right? And that was when I started practicing that. I'll be honest about that too. When I started practicing that made certain elements of my time in the military change. I was, even though it was still a lot, and I still had to navigate through a lot of hurts and pains and things of the sort. The more I was able to take my mind off of certain things and certain outcomes and certain perspectives, and really just starting to embrace that's just the way it is, and not from a place of just being you can't do anything about it, but more so just again, personnel are going to be the personnel. I know what the personnel are going to do. I know how they carry themselves. I know the attitude. I know the mindset. Okay, when X, Y, and Z happens, I know that they're going to go JK, LMNOP. Got you. And then I just tell my guys, hey, be prepared for JK, LMNOP. And then when JK, LMNOP happens, we're not as, we're not so caught off guard by it. And we're, okay, it is what it is. And that, again, that helps to make life, again, manageable. Right? Because we already know what it is. And it's not something that I'm doing to you. It's not something that someone else might be doing. It might be coming from somewhere else. Okay, cool. If it's not in my control, there's nothing I can do about it. Right? And then you just leave it at that. And in doing all of that, embracing all of that, that really allows us to navigate a lot of how we carry ourselves as a whole. It helps us to navigate how to embrace, the challenges, the ups and downs, the pitfalls, the traps, the snares, and everything else in life. Right? Because again, we realize and we recognize at that point that things happen, and that's okay. Right? There's no reason to be upset. There's no reason to be, over the top. We're trusting God in the process, and through trusting God in the process, we're allowing for Him to show us and be with us, and let those things be what they are. And with that, let's learn and cultivate how to be graceful under pressure. Dear Lord, Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day. I thank you for teaching us about being graceful under pressure, learning how to tap into our strengths, knowing how to embrace uncertainties in life, how to be resilient in our situations, bouncing back from letdowns and failures, being able to embrace the idea of knowing what our perspectives are, being able to live according to what your word says, which is trusting in you in everything and allowing you to guide our path. And I pray, Father, that your will be done in all of our lives. I pray, Father, that we find ourselves not only being able to trust you with the small things, but in all things. I pray, Father, that we're able to create disciples, and we're able to become disciples, and we're able to share discipleship, and we're able to take back the earth as you have it. All these things we ask in your holy and heavenly name. Amen. I thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, for taking the time to come out and fellowship with us and learning how to build, grace under pressure, being able to be resilient, being able to have that strength. I really pray that this is a great guide. It helps. I do understand that, with regard to certain things that we teach, we really kind of put a lot of truth coatings on things. We really just give a lot of people some quotes and phrases and catchphrases and lines and zingers and one-liners and things of that sort. But I really hope that being able to discuss this, we're able to look at the idea of really being able to be practical about navigating through our challenges. Right? We don't have to have this magical formula. We don't need to have some crazy over-the-top type of thing to just come in and swoop us. And we don't have to work ourselves by running into wall after wall after wall, thinking that's the only way that we can navigate through the process. But we are allowing ourselves to grow and develop as we need to. I pray that you guys all find your purpose. I pray you all find your success. And until next time, this is the Rebuild Podcast. I love you all. Peace.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. Tune in weekly as we dive into topics such as finding your calling, overcoming obstacles, building resilience, and strengthening your relationship with God. If you're ready to embark on a transformative journey of faith and personal growth, then join us on the Rebuild Podcast. Together, let's build a solid foundation that aligns with God's will and leads us to a life of purpose and fulfillment.